Hello, smart community friends, and welcome back to Mobility March. All of this month, we're talking all things mobility, which by now you probably know is one of my favorite topics. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a brilliant chat with Sandra Phillips, shared mobility architect and the founder and CEO of MovMi, a boutique agency that turns mobility visions into reality. Sandra tells us about her background and her passion for shared mobility and how working at Car2Go sparked her interest in the smart mobility space. We talk about how transport and mobility fits into this smart community space and what a smart community with a smart transport ecosystem means to Sandra. Sandra then tells us about Car2Go and MovMi and why she founded it. We then discuss mobility infrastructure in metro versus regional and better planning and policy for new forms of mobility, plus partnerships and genuine collaboration between public and private sector. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trends of holistic thinking of the overall transport system and the importance of telling diverse stories and sharing diverse perspectives in this space. Just to note, we did record this episode back in December of 2020, and of course, we all know that things have changed since then, so please just keep that in mind when you're listening. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Sandra. How are you today?
I am great. Hi, I'm calling from the evening time on my side to your morning time next day.
Yes, I'm in the future, which feels very weird or bizarre. Yes. Well, it's so great to have you on the podcast. Let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Yes, I can. So my name is Sandra Phillips, and I work for a small organization called MovMi. We specialize in shared mobility, which has been my passion for the last 10 years. And when I say shared mobility, just so we're all clear, it's like the short-term, on-demand access to any type of vehicle, whether that's a bus or a motorcycle or a bike or a kick scooter or a car, doesn't really matter. It's when and if you need it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's just dive in a little bit deeper and tell us what sparked your interest in, I guess, the shared mobility space, but then how that fits into this whole smart community technology space.
Mm-hmm. So it's probably partly, you know how these things go. It's partly coincidence, partly a lot of things just lined up. I got into the field in about 2010 now, so 10 years ago, when I was hired by Car2Go, which is Daimler's car sharing program, to bring that to Canada. Initially, it was a little pilot, and it was just whether or not they will even launch in Vancouver, Canada or not. And ultimately, the decision was it would be launched. And so once the first time I brought a car sharing project or a shared mobility project to life in the city, I realized what an impact it had. Because, when I would go to parties before it was live, and people would ask me, so what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I work in car sharing. They'd be like, what is that exactly? Never heard of it. And then you'd explain it, and it's very theoretical, right? It's a lot of technology that moves vehicles around. And then it became real. And then I would go to parties, maybe about 6 months into the project, and people be like, hey, I came with Car2Go. It's the best thing ever. I used my smartphone to book one, and I came here. And that's when I'm like, this is amazing. Like, it actually changed how people moved around in the city. So I think that's how I got really hooked on it. I still get as excited as back then when we launch a new project and the vehicles all of a sudden start to move and you can see them and you can track them on, a map. But your question was, how does that fit in to smart communities? I think smart communities essentially, is where we live, but also where we move around. Like, transportation for me is always kind of like the arteries that connect this entire system and gets us from place A to B, to our friends, to shopping, whatever. I know we're moving a little bit less these last months, but still, It's ultimately what moves us around. So I think it's a big part, and it's quite frankly a big part that's quite broken because it's been so focused on cars specifically, and so much of our infrastructure has been dedicated to that one mode over everything else. So
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. I'm also a huge advocate, or I don't know, can you be an advocate for mobility? I just think that mobility has to be part of the system. And these days, it is physical connection, but then also how digital plays a huge role in maybe you don't have to move, and maybe that's part of our smart mobility plan or whatever. But then when you do want to move, it should be easy, it should be efficient, it should be affordable, it should be effective no matter where you are, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think it's a huge part in the smart community space. But that's exciting. And I do love it when, you're at a party and you're like, oh, I do this, like smart cities, smart communities. I still have I don't know what that is, but it's getting better. It's like, oh, yeah, I've heard about that. This is happening, whatever. And so I think more and more, and I'm excited for the day where I go to a party and people are like, oh, you're working in that space? Cool. I heard about this and let's talk about it. Or I'm in that space too, and I'm in a completely different field, whatever. But it's exciting. Okay, let's go to what is a smart community to you?
So obviously I'm a little bit biased, but for me, a smart community is one that has a smart transportation ecosystem where essentially, we understand what residents need and how they need to move around. And then we use the latest technology to create more sustainable, equitable, affordable transportation solution. And we use that technology to orchestrate it better. As I said, currently it's still very car focused, but it's also like this vehicle is a delivery vehicle and this vehicle is, your personal vehicle. And really they sit around half of the time. So if we can actually use that data, make it smarter, how we move things around for different use cases, I think that's the other part. I always talk about, at MovMi, we talk about shared mobility architecture. And if it helps me frame not only what we do, but also how it fits into the smart community space. I think it's, architecture covers design, the planning, and the building of a building. And in our case, it covers the design, the planning, and the building of a new service. And it always, in architecture, good architecture starts with the user. And then you look at the built environment. They have, you have different regulations, you have different geographical challenges that impact transportation or building a house. And then, only then, will you decide what technology you want to use. Because for us, it's an enabler, it's a building block. It's really just a building block that you choose to figure out how you now are going to serve that need of residents. So I think that's how it all ties together for me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think those building blocks are so important and getting those foundations right, because throwing an autonomous vehicle like and I think I've said this heaps of times on the podcast, so people in the audience are probably going, yes, Zoe, we know you've said this before. But throwing an autonomous shuttle bus or something isn't solving a problem if that's all it's doing, right? And I think a lot of the things that we can solve, particularly around access, could be solved now through the technology we already have available. So it's actually looking at, well, what are those pain points? What are those things? Building that out, building that network, and being an engineer, system of systems, how does that all work together? Then getting the technology and people resources of how to actually make it happen. So, I think that's so important. Now, I want to go back a little bit. So you're at Car2Go, and then how did you get to where you are now at MovMi?
So MovMi is my own company, and I founded it after I left Car2Go. Part of the reason was I love this kind of, as I described, the shared mobility architecture piece, like thinking through of, okay, how do I design it? How do I plan it? And how do I build it so it's actually useful for a community? And I just had this, to a certain degree, inkling that this could be a useful skill for other organizations because it's such a new space. Now there's more and more people, but 10 years ago, there was few people who actually had done it, especially with super high tech enabled systems. Car2Go is quite, at the time, it was state of the art when it came to car sharing 2.0 or 3.0 even.
Actually, before we go on, sorry, I'm going to interrupt your answer to the question that I've asked. Car2Go, so for people that don't know what that is, can you just give a very brief 101?
Yeah. So Car2Go is a free floating car share service, which essentially means the big difference to what you might be used to in traditional car sharing is you have to bring the vehicle back to the same location where you picked it up. So you have to reserve it in advance. You have to know exactly when you want to go, how long you need it, and you bring it back. It's kind of car rental through a smartphone. Now, Car2Go, the difference was you did not need to bring it back to the same location. It's called free floating. So you can go, let's say, good example is Friday night, going downtown. I'm going to a bar. So now I drive there with the Car2Go. But obviously, I don't want to drive back. So now on the way home, we'd much rather take a cab. So that's the idea is it's one way, it's a lot more flexible. But for that to work, you need a lot more technology because you need to track where the vehicles are. I need to see where the vehicle closest to me is and how they move around, essentially. And I'm using the car sharing example, but dockless scooters is exactly the same. Not dockless scooters. Scooters, e-scooters, kick scooters, micromobility, or dockless bikes function exactly the same way. And that was the big shift that was possible, quite frankly, in 2000. Car2Go started in 2008, and it was possible because of some of the advances we had made around GPS technology and app development, right?
Okay, so back to you. So you were at Car2Go, and then...
So there was this idea that this skill might be useful for others because there seemed to be an interest in providing more flexible transportation solutions. And quite frankly, transportation solutions, and as I say, move people out of their personal cars, especially in dense urban areas. But I also want to do that outside from a organization, because if you're within an organization, everybody will tell you after a while, you see everything through that lens. And it's kind of this cookie cutter approach of how to do something, which I didn't necessarily always agree with because every community is different and transportation patterns specifically are quite different depending on the community. So I wanted to have the ability to take that knowledge, but really tailor the solutions to the people and the residents of different communities. A rural community has very different needs and also very different budgets to implement these solutions than, let's say, Metro Vancouver or Toronto or New York, right? So that allowed me to do that. And, we've been now around for 6 years and we have more than 60 projects worldwide completed. So we established ourselves kind of as an expert in this field.
Mm-hmm. And how does what you do fit into that overarching transportation system? You were talking about cities and regions and rural areas, they have different levels of public transport, which, serves the community, et cetera, and getting cars off road, get them into buses and trains, et cetera. How do you fit into that ecosystem and work together? And I imagine, and again, I'm just assuming that it's kind of transformed, the systems now may be able to talk to each other of public transport and all that type of stuff as well. Whereas before it would have been okay, well, this is a new system. Maybe there isn't public transport, particularly in rural areas, and maybe this serves as, public transport, et cetera, et cetera.
I think there's a couple of different ways it works together. I would say historically, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, they would see each other as competition, really. Like public transit thought, these new forms, they're taking away some of my riders. But really, ultimately, and this goes back to what you mentioned earlier, system thinking, like ecosystem thinking, ultimately providing different options for different use cases, right? If I want to go grocery shopping, it's probably not the best way for me to get home with a load of groceries from, Costco on a bus. I may just not want to do that. So giving me the option to have a vehicle for that case, or when it's sunny, it actually might be a good idea if I do some physical exercise and take a bike share. Right? So giving up people options. And what I will tell you, this year, as much as the pandemic has been quite a challenge for public transit, the one thing it has done is there is a lot more of an understanding that we actually have to collaborate. And if we want people not to go back to their own vehicles, it would be a good idea to integrate this shared new mobility world into public transit and see it as an ecosystem. So I think it's accelerated some of the collaboration efforts that started before. And there's really less of this, you're a competitor. It's we're all in the same boat and our objective is to get people out of their personal cars. Now, going back to your rural question, that's obviously a very different challenge, right? I'm in Vancouver and a large part of Canada, similar to where you're from, is just lots of land and not much in between and a lot less infrastructure. And to a certain degree, similar to public transit, shared mobility needs a certain density. Now, there are certain types of shared mobility that work really well for rural areas. For instance, microtransit, which ultimately, I always try to explain it as simply as a carpooling app attached to a little small bus where you book a seat, works extremely well. There's lots of projects in Canada and the US where transit agency funds these more flexible services. So you as a resident have ultimately feels like more option rather than one fixed route that goes around, a loop in your city, because that's all they can afford. It picks you up where you are, and it costs them almost the same because it only picks you up when and if you need it, rather than, just having a route a bus that keeps looping with two people in it for the majority of the time, right? So there are some, and this goes back to my point earlier, right? It's just because we have all this technology and these new forms of mobility, they don't all work great in a specific context. You have to pick and choose what works well and what makes most sense.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think it's thinking about the whole of journey as well. Like you were saying before, like if we're going into town, then maybe we're leaving at midnight or whatever, maybe there isn't a bus or whatever available, and that's okay because we can get a, rideshare or whatever. But then also, these other options that will work well in rural areas. But also I think you have to show people that it works as well. I think that's one of the big things. And I think particularly in regional areas, it's like, oh, what's this new thing? No one's told me about it. There's this journey, that we need to go on as well. And I think also supporting infrastructure too, if you're talking about scooters and bicycles, even like in regional areas. I don't know how it is. I have been to Canada, but in Australia, we don't necessarily have the best infrastructure in regional areas for cycling, et cetera, et cetera. However, we can do things that can enable that, and we can use the wide roads that we have to, change the behaviours, et cetera, et cetera. And I think if we can show these things are, useful and helping people and making our lives better, then we'll have a better chance of getting them full scale or adopted. At a large scale. Yeah.
Your point about infrastructure is so important. It's kind of, and this is where I also think this is another area where the smart city movement and the smart mobility movement kind of start to overlap, right? The smarter your infrastructure is, and you understand, where maybe the intersection is with the most accidents, depending on what you're measuring, the better you can anticipate and plan, I should also say, from a policy side, how you deal with these new forms of mobility. And maybe that, introducing a kick scooter program is not the smartest because you'll just have, it's a road safety issue at this point still, but maybe get the policy in place and change the infrastructure and dedicate a lane, and then it makes a lot of sense to introduce that program.
Yeah, another thing that I think sometimes we think, oh, well, policy people sit over here and infrastructure people sit over here and planning over here and city over here and mobility over here. And it's just like, no, we all have to work together, which, sounds cliche, but it's so true, because if you don't have those things in place, and I think the community as a whole probably doesn't understand that aspect of it, but they feel the benefits of it once, it is aligned, and we can make decisions across all different, levels of government. But that's one thing, but it's all the departments within the government as well, which is also a challenge at times. So,
which is so true. And I can't remember, a couple of weeks ago, I listened to one of the podcasts where you sat in the hot seat and you were talking about the fact that, within the government, each department does their own little thing. And it's the same, especially in new mobility. You have a team that deals with data in a larger community anyway, or a municipality. And then you have a team that deals with parking infrastructure. And then you have a team that deals with road infrastructure. And then you have another team that licenses all these new businesses. And none of them talk with each other to figure out, okay, how do we move this forward together? So I think it's within municipalities, and then it's outside. It's also one of the things that I keep talking a lot about right now is, there's a bit of a perception, and I understand where it's coming from, that these new mobility industry people are taking advantage to a certain degree. And, Uber just rolled and steamrolled over a lot of cities. And then some of these kick scooter programs just dumped thousands of them in municipalities. So people got annoyed, and I understand why there is maybe a bit of hesitation, but I really think industry is not all evil, and industry can solve some of the things that are really, really hard to solve, especially for public transit. Like first and last mile, that problem has been around for decades, and public transit can't really solve it that well. And new forms of mobility actually can, to a certain degree anyway. And if you have a smart policy framework incentivizing the right thing that really ties into community goals, such as sustainability or equity, like higher level, not operational nitty-gritty goals, higher level goals, if you tie them to those, then you can have a real impact. And you can introduce something that is beneficial in the bigger picture, rather than, I think we had a tendency of letting them do whatever they wanted. And then it pendulum swung to like, we're going to mandate how many vehicles they need to have in each neighborhood. And that doesn't work either. So hopefully it moves back into kind of the middle of it.
Yeah, I think partnerships are really key, and they're going to be more and more key in the future of how these things come together and operate, and particularly mobility, where, it's everybody's problem, right? This is everybody's problem. And it's complex, and it's not going to have one solution. And I think that's where, the partnerships and the collaboration, the genuine collaboration and integration, all the buzzwords, but real is something that's really, really important. And I don't think we can't get away from that. No one organisation, no, like private or public, will not be able to do it alone. And I also think the skill sets as well. We need to hone in on those skill sets that we require, because I think they're not the same as they were before. I heard a quote that was like, the skills required or to solve the problem aren't going to be the ones that created it, or something like that. And it's not to say it's people, different people, like it's not to say they all need to be different people, but it's like building the skill sets and working with different people that may be from different industries. I think that's a real key. And also bringing in the experiences of people that may not normally be heard in these public forums or private forums, whatever. So then we can actually, tailor solutions as much as possible to that specific community, like you were talking about. But it requires and again, I've said this on the podcast, like a radical level of engagement, which is very different to what we do now. So I think there has to be more and more investment into this engagement piece. But also then, how does that translate into something that's useful? Because you're not going to solve everybody's problems all the time, but it's thinking about the people with the most at stake if we don't get this right, and then how do we write for that? So something I've been thinking about a lot as well. But anyway, enough about me. I want to talk about you a bit more. So let's flick over and tell us about some of the projects you've been working on. Yes.
I was going to say, I can give you a couple of good real examples.
Let's do it.
We have projects across the globe, but I'm going to pick two here in Metro Vancouver because they're very much collaborations. And so they tie into kind of that piece of it. So the first one is a public-private partnership between the Public Transit Agency, the local one here, and 3 private shared mobility providers to provide car sharing. They're technically kind of competitors. They offer a bit different business models. So one offers the kind of traditional one, and the other one offers the free-floating. And then the third partner is bike share. And so, like a lot of cities, we have all these options. And Vancouver is actually, it used to be dubbed the car share capital of North America. It probably still is, actually. We have just over 3,000 car share vehicle, and about 30% of the population has a membership in one of them. We also have a very strong public transit network, and ridership kept increasing every year until the pandemic hit, but that's a different story. But they all worked in isolation of each other. So, you had all these different apps, and it was all app driven. It was also not, if you didn't have a smartphone, it wasn't exactly super equitable. So what we did, I should say, MovMi essentially was responsible for the overall project and program management of this. So we came together as a group and said, okay, the big vision is mobility as a service. Everybody talks about this. The project in Finland, the WIM project, that's kind of the North Star. Now, that also freaks everybody out because there's a lot of data sharing, a lot of additional software that you need to procure, and who is covering that cost, etc. So what if we did something that was low tech, but achieved the same thing. And we used the transit fare card, which is an RFID card, and integrated that into the other three systems because they all operate with RFID as well, but they have their own little dongles. So they all had their own thing. So fairly low tech, corporate pilot program, extremely successful, extremely well received. It was 13 organizations for just over a year. And we went right through the pandemic. And this is why I was like, it actually was so interesting to see the data because people started being scared about public transit. And so they shifted over to shared mobility. So we could keep them in this ecosystem, right? And still provide them with options that didn't require them to purchase a vehicle, which is an expensive purchase as well, right? So that's a very real example. The pilot is concluded and I can't really say too much, but the private-public partnership continues. And as I said, there is a real, where before we had to build trust, and I sometimes felt like a marriage negotiator or mediator between the parties, aligning the different interests. There is real trust in the group now and willingness to take this forward to the next level. So maybe if anybody follows what we're doing in Vancouver, then possibly at some point next year, there'll be an announcement and you'll see what the next thing is.
Very cool.
Yeah, so that's one that we're super proud of because it literally built this partnership over 18 months and it's solid now. And then another one, which goes back to our rural conversation, is a microtransit project for an island community. So Metro Vancouver is on the coast, right? And there's a lot of island communities and they're very small. And a lot of islands, just like a lot of rural communities, have aging population, a higher level of older people. And they had a fixed bus route, which went twice a day to connect to the ferry. But it wasn't exactly, like if you didn't live right next to the bus stop, it was actually quite challenging, especially because the island also has, I can't remember what it's called, but ultimately light pollution is a big issue for them. So they have no street lights. So if you need to catch a bus in the evening during the winter months, it's pitch black. So we essentially introduced a microtransit shuttle bus where you could pick your location. And it wasn't exactly that they picked you up right at your doorstep, but on the closest flag stop. And there were a lot more flag stops, virtual flag stops, they're called, than the regular ones. And it was a really well-received pilot program. And that one was run by the Public Transit Agency. So bringing in, the private technology provider to, I guess, modernize, you could call it, or bring forward their existing infrastructure to something that's a lot easier to use. The other thing with that one is, as much as you could use an app, it was all app-based. Because Public Transit Agency was behind it, we also made sure that people who didn't have a smartphone could dial in and book a seat on the bus and a flag stop to be picked up. So I find it really interesting working with both groups because public transit really has this lens of, okay, how do we make sure it's equitable for everybody? And how do we, sometimes it's as simple as like providing a phone number. It really wasn't anything more than that. Mm-hmm. But now, like my grandma can call in rather than having to fight with her smartphone, right?
Absolutely. And I think looking at the demographics and just the needs of the people there is so important because, it's all well and good to have this fancy thing. But if people can't use it, then it makes it worse because then they get despondent about the technology rather than it helping them. Yeah. Now, speaking of technology, let's move. Well, it doesn't actually have to be about technology, but what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
I think there's a couple that I could think of. I think one is goes back to what I mentioned earlier, this orchestration of this overall transportation system. So if you start not thinking about it, okay, we have bike share, we have car share, and we have public buses, and they're all separate. But if you start to connect them and look at it a bit more holistically, I think you actually have the ability to orchestrate that entire system better. And that goes into kind of the second, and I don't think a lot of people think about it. It's really, ultimately, it's about increasing utilization, right? So we don't have assets that just, like vehicles generally sit around 95% of the time. They sit in a parking lot. What a waste of our public spaces. So how do you use it more? But I think unless it's connected and somebody actually has a view of it, of the entire system, it's really hard to do that. And so I think that's one emerging trend. And I think it'll be a couple of years, to be frank, until we're at that point, because we're just starting to plug in the different systems, right? So it will take a bit of time before we get there. And then who is responsible for that? I do not know. That's a big, hairy question, I think. But along with that, the other trend that really the pandemic has kind of escalated is the merging of this personal mobility with delivery. There's a much bigger need for delivery vehicles, and there is a supply on the shared mobility side that has, at least during a certain period of time, had less utilization. And so they started forming partnerships, something that historically they haven't. It was like you couldn't merge delivery with, personal mobility. That just wasn't something you could do. And so that's starting. I think the biggest hurdle there is insurance. So once we figured that piece out, I think that side will really take off because there's an interest on both sides to make this work. And then the last one goes into kind of a point that you mentioned. And I know from your podcast that, as I said, I listened to a couple of weeks ago, that you also keep talking about that. But it's not a tech trend. It's really about increasing diversity in this space. My space, and I imagine this general smart community space is similar. Shared mobility is at the intersection of technology, urban planning, engineering, all very male-dominant spaces. So we have all these solutions really work really well for a young urban male, above average income, above average education group. And we have not really figured out a lot of the rest of the population. So increasing diversity, and not, at least maybe because I'm really involved in that space, but it seems to me anyway that this year we're gaining momentum, and there is at least more attention on it, that we need to do this. Mm. So I think that's the last kind of trend that I identified.
Yeah, and I think it's an important one, and I think it's also one that won't have just one solution either. And so I'm been doing some work in that space as well in the engineering field, and I guess around changing the narrative of what it means to be in this space as well, because there's that side that we want people attracted to it, not only if they're maths and science and whatever, but if they're creative, if they care about sustainability, if they care about communities, whereas traditionally they might go into another field like humanities or whatever. But also those are really important too. And so it's actually that intersection, because you can do a lot in, developing countries, or even in your own country, being an engineer. You can build solutions, you can solve complex problems like solutions to climate change and all these type of things. You don't necessarily have to be, you can move down that I want to help people, I want to change the world path. And we want people to think, I wonder how technology can help me with that, or I wonder how, or what questions do I need to ask of technology to do that, and what's happening now in technology, and how do I shape what I want it to be in the future, because right now it's a bit weird, let's be honest. So I think there's so much in that, and I think if we can change that narrative, because we need more people with the skills that engineers and technologists have. And I don't think it's someone is better than others. It's just what you build over time, and what you build and what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway.
Back to one of the key pieces that I remember that you mentioned before is like, you have to tell your story.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, especially if you want to increase diversity, you also have to show the different stories and the different people that are in the space working on these problems.
Absolutely.
Rather than just having, you go to a typical transportation conference and there's a certain group that keeps telling the story, and you need to bring in these other perspectives, because then it gets appealing to a lot larger audience and group.
Agreed. Okay, I think we could have a whole podcast on that topic, and maybe we should, but I realize we have to wrap up. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Sandra. I really have enjoyed it, and I do feel like we can have many more a conversation, and time just seems to go quickly. This year, it's insane. This episode will go out in 2021, so you'll be one of the first ones out in 2021, which I'm also super excited about. And who knows what 2021 will bring, so I think it will be interesting. Yeah, not that we're going to dwell on 2020, but okay. to finish off, tell people how they can connect with you.
There's a couple of different ways. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's probably the fastest, right? Look up Sandra Phillips and MovMi, MovMi, and you'll find me. Or Shared Mobility, you'll find me. The other one is through our website. So that's movmi.net, movme.net. So probably the two best ways to connect.
Cool. We'll put the links in the show notes. I think I found you on LinkedIn, so that worked well. And yeah, thanks again for coming onto the podcast. And I do really look forward to our next conversation because I think, we can dive a bit deeper into some of these different topics. And I'm actually also keen to hear more about some of the other projects, successful project or lessons learned from projects as well. Let's have another combo sometime soon.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks for inviting me. This has been great, like all the way from Vancouver to Australia. Yes. I like it.
Technology. So I know, it's crazy. And it all worked, which is amazing. So, okay, we'll say goodbye and we'll talk soon. See ya.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great. Thanks.
Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're looking for support in podcast strategy and production, workshop design and facilitation, or communication and media advisory, get in touch. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.